Good evening, and welcome to this evening's Rosenbach Behind the Bookcase, a friend, a foe, and a fair youth, finding Shakespeare in early printings. So I am Andrew White, and I manage the tour guides at the Rosenbach. I also manage our In Conversation With in-person programs, and also our Behind the Bookcase programs, like the ones you're seeing right now. So, a little bit about the Rosenbach. The Rosenbach lives in two townhomes side by side on Delancey Place in Philadelphia, right by Rittenhouse Square. And let's take a little bit of a look at the next slide. We can take a look at what's on the inside. So, who were the Rosenbach brothers? They were dealers and collectors in rare books and manuscripts, art, and fine furniture. Abraham Rosenbach, the younger of the two brothers, was the top rare book dealer of his day. At the end of the brothers' lives in the early 1950s, Abe and Phil set up the Rosenbach Foundation so that their home and collections could be shared. The Rosenbach house, our exhibits, and our garden are open to the public. Some of our programs are online just at the moment, but if you'd like to come for a tour, you're welcome to do so. Check us out. When we're fully open again, we even offer biblio cocktail parties. We're so glad you're here with us now to keep the conversation going. So moving to the next slide. This evening, we'll be looking at two of Shakespeare's contemporaries and what they made of him, and also what he made of one of his contemporaries. So who we're seeing pictured here, who we're actually not seeing, is Francis Mears, who was the friend and wrote a really great review of Shakespeare. We don't have any contemporary pictures of what Francis Mears looked like, which is too bad. We are seeing a picture of the foe. It's kind of a witty picture because the one thing that he's remembered for is his book, A Green's Groat's Worth of Wit. He wrote it while he was dying, supposedly, and then it was published after he was dead. So in this funny picture of him here in the upper right, it actually shows him in his winding sheet, already dead, but still writing. The other pictures are of the fair youth from Shakespeare's sonnets. There are a ton of theories as to who the fair youth was. I'm just going with Henry Risley tonight, young aristocrat. We, like I said, we absolutely do not know. I like Henry Risley, not because I'm going to make an argument that this was the real fair youth, but just because he kind of fits the sonnets. The sonnets talk about Shakespeare being really taken with a young man who is extremely androgynous. And if you look at the image of Henry Risley at the top left of the screen there, that portrait was for more than 100 years thought to be of a woman. And after a while, scholars realized, hang on, this is Henry Risley. So even after he's gone, he's still confusing people because of his androgynous look. The other reason I like Henry Risley is because he got married without getting permission from Queen Elizabeth I, naughty, naughty, and he got in big trouble. He got thrown in the Tower of London, and there's a picture of him at the bottom of the screen there with the cat. I like Henry Risley because when he went to prison, he took his cat with him. So I think that's pretty great. So, moving to the next slide, let's take a look at the Friend of Shakespeare. This is the 1598 edition of Palladius Tamia, the Wit's Treasury, that lives at the Rosenbach. Today, we think of Shakespeare as the greatest playwright ever, right? Probably the greatest writer ever. But in his day, this wasn't necessarily the case. He was one of many playwrights. He was very successful, but, maybe not the best of the best, but pretty good. One person who shared our modern view of Shakespeare as the greatest ever was the clergyman and writer Francis Mears. The Rosenbach has this beautifully rebound edition of Francis Mears' Palladius Tamia, or the Wit's Treasury, or the Wit's Commonwealth. Palladius Tamia roughly translates from the Latin as Athena's pantry. And there is a lot of stuff crammed in this pantry. Thoughts on life, morality, religion, and literature. Going to the next slide, we can see that what ties it all together is the similitude, or the comparison. Here's a nice one to get us started. Quote, as gold and a pearl make one ring, so God and man make one Christ. This book, this big fat book, is composed entirely of strings of comparisons just like that. I have to say, I have not been able to think of a parallel genre of book that exists today. The part that we're interested in, and we'll see on the next slide, is the comparative discourse of our English poets with the Greek, Latin, and Italian poets. You can see I've highlighted the similitude, as Homer is reputed the prince of Greek poets and Petrarch of Italian poets, so Chaucer is accounted the god of English poets. I love that Homer and Petrarch are princes, but Chaucer is a god. When Mears gets to Shakespeare, he compares him to the Roman poet Ovid and to the Roman playwrights Plautus and Seneca in 3 paragraphs over 2 pages. If we go to the next slide, you can see it. And then we can take another trip to the next slide and we'll zoom in on it. So on the left is our first comparison of Shakespeare. Shakespeare the poet. It goes, the soul of Euphorbus was thought to live in Pythagoras. And what the heck? That's a mouthful, right? What does that mean? The ancient mathematician Pythagoras believed that he was the reincarnation of one of the warriors of the Iliad, Euphorbus. As the soul of Euphorbus was thought to live in Pythagoras, so the sweet, witty soul of Ovid, the Roman poet, lives in mellifluous and honey-tongued Shakespeare. Witnesses Venus and Adonis, his Lucrece, which are 2 early narrative poems by Shakespeare and 2 big sellers for him, his sugared sonnets among his private friends, etc. So, just looking at the first sentence, Mears calls Shakespeare sweet 4 times. His sonnets are sugared. He himself is, quote, honey-tongued and mellifluous, which comes from the Latin meaning flowing honey, and he's the reincarnation of sweet, witty Ovid. Shakespeare's contemporaries are always using the word sweet to describe him, whether honoring him, like Richard Barnfield, who the same year that this came out, 1598, wrote a poem praising contemporary poets and referring to Shakespeare as the honey flowing and describing his early narrative poems as sweet. But Shakespeare is also made fun of for being sweet by having a comical character in a play that was written for university students to perform. It's called the Parnassus Plays. There were 3 of them. They were written for college kids to perform. And in one of these Parnassus Plays, there's a college student who says, "Oh, sweet Mr. Shakespeare, I'll have his picture in my study." And this character also keeps a copy of Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis under his pillow. So, whether you're mocking him or praising him, Shakespeare at this time is always referred to as sweet. Next paragraph, top of the next page, Mears looks at Shakespeare as a playwright. And I'm going to read what this says, but if you can identify which of the Shakespeare plays mentioned here we no longer have the text of, please post that in the chat. And if I can find the chat, I'm going to take a look for it. If you get it right, you get a gold star for tonight's Behind the Bookcase. Okay, so it says, and this is talking about Shakespeare as a playwright. As Plautus and Seneca are accounted the best for comedy and tragedy among the Latins, so Shakespeare is among the English the most excellent in both kinds for the stage. So what Mears is saying, Shakespeare's the best at everything, comedy, tragedy, whatever. For comedy, witness his Gentleman of Verona, his Errors, his Love's Labour's Lost, his Love's Labour's Won, his Midsummer Night's Dream, and his Merchant of Venice. For tragedy, his Richard II, Richard III, Henry IV, King John, Titus Andronicus, and also Romeo and Juliet. And it looks like Nicole is going to get the gold star for the day. Ooh, and Emma's coming in. Emma's a dark horse. So both of them called out. It is Love's Labour's Won. Very good. Gold star to the both of you. Yeah, that's one of 2 Shakespeare plays that we know of, but we no longer have. The other one is Cardenio, which would be a really fun one to have because Shakespeare always was great at mad scenes, right? And Cardenio is about a character in Cervantes who goes mad and wanders out into the mountains and like, oh, I wish we had this text of Cardenio. And it'd be fun to have Love's Labour's Won as well. But we're lucky we have the Shakespeare plays that we do. So Mears wraps this up by comparing Shakespeare to the Muses, who are the goddess of poetry and the arts. In the 3rd paragraph, Mears says, as Epius Stolo, who is a Roman orator, said that the Muses speak with Plautus's tongue if they can speak Latin, so I say that the muses would speak with Shakespeare's fine filed phrase if they would speak English. Really high praise, right? Shakespeare was 34 in 1598 when this came out, and I expect he would have seen this. Francis Mears loved Shakespeare, so for that, we love Francis Mears. Moving on to the foe of Shakespeare on the next slide, we're going to take a look at Greene's groat's worth of wit. So, Robert Greene, poor deluded soul, did not love Shakespeare. He was a rival playwright, although in Greene's defense, scholars doubt that he actually wrote the slander we're about to see. It might have been by Henry Chettle, who was also a writer and a playwright and a printer. This is one of those things where you get down into the odds and ends of Shakespeare's life, and it can get so confusing, it's hard to even keep track of it. Nevertheless, we're going to say Greene, just to make this simpler. But when I say Greene, try to imagine that there's some hovering, invisible quotes around the word Greene, because we're not totally sure. The full title of this book, as you'll see on the next slide, the title page, the full title is Greene's groat's worth of wit, bought with a million of repentance, describing the folly of youth, the falsehood of makeshift flatterers, the misery of the negligent, and mischievous of deceiving courtesans, i.e. sex workers, written before his death and published at his dying request. Greene's groat's worth of wit, bought with a million of repentance. Just for starters, what the heck is a groat? A groat's a coin. At this time, it would have been worth about as much as a nickel. So the title is pretty much saying, as sorry as you may be for your youthful mistakes, you still lack common sense. That clever, cynical, hopeless sentiment is the mood of this entire book. Unlike Pallades Tamia that we saw a minute ago by Francis Mears, this book is a genre that is still prevalent today, and you're going to think that I'm pulling your leg. It's a short, goofy, bitter narrative that takes potshots of contemporaries. Where have you seen that? On TV. This is absolutely the same as a Family Guy or a South Park episode. We're going to go on a goofy little adventure, and along the way, we'll take shots at William Shatner and Elizabeth Warren just for the heck of it. So our edition of Greene's groat's worth is not the original. We have the one from 1617, which is the year after Shakespeare died at age 52. The book was originally published in 1692 when Shakespeare was 28. And it might actually be the first ever printed reference to Shakespeare, even before Francis Mears. At this time, Shakespeare was an actor. He had written a lot of his history plays, 5 comedies, 2 tragedies. But let's get to the passage for which this book is remembered. So on the next slide, we can zoom in. You can see the passage. Actually, we can actually zoom in even closer on the next slide. You'll see where the arrow points to a colon. That's where it starts, and it ends where the arrow points up to that little space. Here's the passage, the famous passage. For there is an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that, with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you, and being an absolute Johannes factotum, is in his own conceit the only Shake scene in a country. Let's start with upstart crow. Upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, suggests a thief. A thief of what? Greene says, quote, he supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you. Blank verse is poetry with meter, rhythm, but no rhyme. Not its originator, but the first English playwright to become known for using blank verse was Christopher Marlowe, who was born 2 months before Shakespeare and tragically died young. Like Robert Greene, Marlowe was university educated, whereas Shakespeare was not, though he did have a really good education up to age 14 and would have been familiar with drama. His dad, John Shakespeare, was the bailiff in Stratford, which is pretty much the same as the mayor. So we're fairly sure, although there's no records from the school, we're fairly sure Shakespeare went to the Stratford Grammar School, where his teacher would have been Thomas Jenkins, who himself had been a student in London of the author and teacher Richard Mulcaster, who advocated teaching through drama and acting. But Shakespeare was an actor, a player, not a respected profession. So what Robert Greene is saying is, don't you use our literary devices, you upstart. Next insult, tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, in an actor's hide. It's in a different font there. That's actually a quote from one of Shakespeare's early and not often performed history plays, Henry VI, Part 3, which was from 1591, where the Duke of York calls Margaret of Anjou, "Oh, tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide." Um, Margaret of Anjou, Duke of York. Probably the easiest way to explain these characters is if you think about Game of Thrones, um, uh, George R. R. Martin, he's basing his characters on characters from the War of the Roses in British history, right? The Starks are actually the Yorks, the Lannisters are actually the Lancasters. This character, Margaret of Anjou, is the villainess. She is the Cersei Lannister. So here, oh, and the Duke of York is basically the sad, unhappy Ned Stark who spends the entire first season, waiting to die. So the author is using an insult from a Shakespeare play against Shakespeare. The next thing that Green calls Shakespeare is, quote, an absolute Johannes factotum. It's in italics, which just means a jack of all trades, i.e., Shakespeare is an actor and he's also a playwright. And, quote, in his only conceit is the only shake scene in a country. And that one's pretty obvious, right? So Green, if this was Green, interestingly enough, is the only Shakespeare contemporary to accuse Shakespeare of bad character. There are lots of great legends about why Green supposedly dislikes Shakespeare, but in the passage here, it's pretty clearly snobbery. A mere lowly actor should not aspire to be a writer. Ben Jonson was a playwright who was kind of the rival frenemy of Shakespeare. Two gentlemen from Shakespeare's acting company, John Hemmings, Henry Condell. Everybody who knew him said Shakespeare was a really great guy. He was really great to be around. Robert Greene is the only sourpuss in this bunch. Moving on to the sonnets, let's take a look at the next slide. So we've seen a couple of people what they make of Shakespeare. Now we're going to see Shakespeare really puzzling out his relationship to one of his contemporaries and having a tough as heck time with it. And I should say up front, when you look at the characters in the sonnets, the main characters are Shakespeare himself, the beautiful youth, the fair youth, the, quote, dark lady, and also a rival playwright. So I'm going to present this as if these are real characters from Shakespeare's life. There are definitely critics who look at this and say the whole thing's made up. I'm a little bit dubious about that because if you write 126 love poems to a guy that you made up, and then also the Dark Lady sonnets are really dark and really confused and really like dirty bohemian. If you've ever seen Nan Goldin's photographs of like New York bohemians in the Chelsea Hotel, and they're kind of like, whatever, they're not really going places. That's what it feels like if you read these sonnets. If you don't know who Nan Goldin is, like, do an internet search, and that's like the quickest short flight to get to the heart of the sonnet. So Shakespeare's Sonnets was first published in 1609. The Rosenbach has the second edition from 1640. This was published by the much maligned, and I'm going to malign him too, John Benson, not Ben Jonson, John Benson. Our copy is another beautifully rebound volume. Collectors often rebound their books because the original binding of books in this era was just paper covers, and you'd pick up your book from the printer and then walk down to another shop and have it bound according to your taste and according to what was in your wallet, right? So it was totally okay for collectors up until like maybe mid-Victorians to just rebind their books. So this is the spine of the Rosenbach 1640 sonnets. The next slide will show the front, and it's just lovely. Whoever bound this was an artist. And the next slide will even show that the end papers are just exquisite. I think that Shakespeare would have been really, really pleased with that. The only other thing about this publication that Shakespeare would have been pleased with was, next slide, the title page, which Shakespeare would have loved because it describes him as a gentleman. Shakespeare's mother's family may have kind of been something gentry at one time, but his father was a tradesman. He was a glove maker, which is a fine trade, but it's still a trade. He himself is a former actor, which is not something you get into if you're really high-born. So Shakespeare was not a gentleman, despite what this says, but he never stopped trying to become a prosperous gentleman. He tried to get himself a coat of arms for his family. He was denied, but in the end he succeeded, and by the end of his life he died a prosperous man who had risen in the world. Other than calling Shakespeare a gentleman, which is quite nice, the contents of this edition of the Sonnets are notoriously a mess. On the next slide, we'll see one of John Benson, one of his renderings of a Shakespeare sonnet. It's sonnet 44. Right away, we see that something is wrong because Shakespeare's sonnets don't have titles. On the next slide, we'll see a sonnet is supposed to be a 14-line, more or less, poem, right? But what we've got here is a 28-line long sonnet. It's not a sonnet. It's two sonnets stapled together. It's sonnet 44 and sonnet 45, mashed together like two cartoon characters in a trench coat. We think this is maybe because sonnets were less popular in 1640 than they had been in 1609 when the sonnets were originally published. Maybe it's really not sure. So right here before you is the evidence that John Benson is not such a great editor, or maybe he's just a bit of a slob, or maybe he's kind of calculating. That we more or less agree on. What we can't really agree on is, was John Benson a homophobe? On the next slide, you'll see the sonnet that is one of the first 126 sonnets of the sonnets that are written for a beautiful young man. Scholars have agreed on this since Shakespeare's scholarship began in the 1700s. Some of the loveliest and most romantic sonnets that you know, that are familiar to you, are part of the sequence. So think about Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, Let Me Not to the Marriage of True Minds Amid Impediments. These are the sonnets that get used all the time at heterosexual weddings. So why does this poem have a title that suggests that it's about a woman? It's not. So it's only fair to say that Benson has his defenders who will say, hey, he wasn't a bigot. He was just a slob. I'll let you decide for yourself. I don't even know. I don't even have an opinion. On the next slide, you're going to see in his first 126 poems of Shakespeare's 154 poem sonnet sequence, he calls this man, whom scholars call the fair youth, he calls him Lord of my love. So this one wasn't straight-washed. It wasn't heterosexualized. The fair youth also gets called by Shakespeare lovely, beautiful, my love, master, mistress of my passion, my sweet love, my lovely boy, Lord of my love, as you see here. It's definitely puzzled and it's been awkward for scholars and other poets for hundreds of years. They have been arguing about this back and forth. Wordsworth, Swinburne, Robert Browning, all had different opinions about this. 20th century critics like to say, hey, this was just how Renaissance British male poets described their non-romantic same-sex friends. 20th century scholar and Christian apologist C.S. Lewis was not comfortable with the gayness of the sonnets and said he didn't think Shakespeare had ever been with a man, but he did say in his 1954 English Literature in the 16th century, quote, the language of these sonnets is too lover-like for that of ordinary male friendship. I have found no real parallel to such language between friends in 16th century literature. So, next slide. Back to John Benson. Sonnet 101 is here human centipeded onto the end of another one. The sonnet, O Truant Muse, is usually Exhibit A in the argument that Benson was deliberately straightwashing Shakespeare, but it could also be Exhibit A in the argument that Benson was just kind of a mess. The arrow pointing left here, I guess on the next slide we'll see that. The arrow pointing left here shows where Benson heteroized male pronouns to female, right? And then on the next slide, you'll see where he couldn't really be bothered and he just left the male pronouns in. So the poem seems to be about this amazing, beyond gender entity, but I don't think that was intended. I think John Benson is clearly just a little bit sloppy here with his attempts at sloppily straight washing. The first one I should point out, truth needs no color with his color fixed. We're not sure about that. Is the his here referring to the beautiful youth, or is it referring to a personified truth? I'm not really sure. But the rest of them, he, her, her, this is an amazing, like, gender switching moment by moment character in Shakespeare's sonnet. That is not the original sonnet. In the original sonnet, all of those pronouns are male. So we jump ahead to the next slide. You're going to see Shakespeare really grappling with how he feels about this other guy. So it's called here The Exchange. It's not really actually called The Exchange. And I'll read this one to you. This is Sonnet 20, and you can really see Shakespeare is confused about how he feels. I'll read some parts here. A woman's face, with nature's own hand painted, hast thou, the master mistress of my passion. Jumping ahead to line 7, a man in hue, in all hues in his controlling, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth. So let's jump to the next one. I want you to look at this line that says, a man in hues, all hues in his controlling. It's kind of quirky because the second time, or when hues appears in the middle of that line, it's capitalized and it's italics. People are puzzled about what the heck this means for literally for hundreds of years. The next thing that I want you to pay attention to, if we go to the very next slide, a man in hue, all hues in his controlling, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth, and for a woman wert thou first created. So that's kind of interesting, right? And what I've done here is I've put an early portrait of Henry Risley, who is a young aristocrat, and we looked at him before, how androgynous he was in his youth and how he brought his cat with him when he went to the Tower of London. This portrait, as I said before, for more than 100 years, people thought, oh, it was of a woman. So I love the fact that even after his death, Henry Risley is like playing a mind scramble around gender with what gender he is. And you can see that the mind scramble starts right here with Shakespeare. It's only fair to say he is one of many possibilities for who the fair youth is. And there also are critics who will say, we don't think there ever was any fair youth. So I want to put that front and center. I'm using Henry Risley because I think he's interesting. I think he's the most interesting of the different suspects for who's the fair youth. But do we know? No, we really don't. A man in hue, all hues in his controlling, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth. And for a woman wert thou first created, till nature, as she wrought thee, fell a doting, and by addition me of thee defeated, by adding one thing to my purpose nothing. But since she pricked thee out for women's pleasure, mine be thy love, and thy love's use their treasure. And the word prick in this sonnet means exactly what you think it means. You've got something, you look like this beautiful woman, but you've got one thing going on there that makes me feel like maybe you're not really for me. Shakespeare is so upfront about both his love and his confusion for this fair youth. So let's take a look at the very next slide. One last look at Sonnet 20. We'll see how hue and hues is used here. Oh, sorry, we've already done that. I want to take a look at, remember what I said about hues, and I want to take a look at Sonnet 135, where the word will shows up 10 times, as you'll see in the very next slide. There is a whole lot of will in this sonnet. So there's kind of a theory that the person, the fair youth to whom these sonnets were written, was somebody named Willie Hughes. And you can kind of understand that because this sonnet seems to be written by a guy named Will Shakespeare, to a person whose name is also Will. And there's a little bit more of kind of raunchy punning on the word will, if you think about what the word Willie means in British parlance, right? So it's kind of one of the racier. If you think about what the kind of sexual slang was of the day, this becomes one of the racier of the sonnets. The use of will and hues and in the dedication of the first edition of the sonnets is to a mysterious Mr. W.H. Nobody knows who Mr. W.H. is, but there came to be a theory that Mr. W.H. was the fair youth, and it was a person named Willie Hughes In Victorian days and before, there was a belief that Willie Hughes was probably a working class guy, maybe one of these actors who dressed as a woman, maybe one of these teenage boys who dressed up as a woman to play female roles in Shakespearean theater. Nowadays, what I read, a lot of the critics are thinking that the fair youth was more aristocratic, more like Henry Risley, and I haven't been able to figure out how or why that change happens from leading up to the Victorians and the Victorians thinking this is a working class guy to modern day critics thinking it's an aristocrat. But somewhere along the line, that change has been made. But the use of will and Hughes and the dedication of the first edition of the sonnets, either from Shakespeare or the publisher Thomas Thorpe, we don't know, another one of those like mind scrambling Shakespeare mysteries. It led to a speculation the fair youth was a man called Willie Hughes. Oscar Wilde picked this up in a short story, which we'll see in the very next slide. His short story was called The Portrait of Mr. W.H. And the Rosenbach actually has some wonderful manuscript material of Oscar Wilde related to this story. It's in Wilde's hand, which you see here. And if we go to the next slide, another great writer picks it up. This is a page from James Joyce's Ulysses, the Scylla and Charybdis episode, which takes place in the National Library of Ireland. And I swear, the characters rehash every single story about and rumor about Shakespeare that ever existed. So what you're seeing here is a Shakespeare's manuscript of Ulysses from the Scylla and Charybdis section, which, if you're a Shakespeare fan, Scylla and Charybdis is so much fun to pick out every possible different Shakespeare reference that ever was. Eventually, in Joyce's story, the conversation swings around to Wilde. And you can see, and his idea of W.H., who the fair youth was. You can see that enlarged here, but I don't even know why I bothered, because James Joyce's handwriting is so hard to read, but I'll read it for you. The most brilliant of all, in terms of who was the fair youth, the most brilliant of all is that story of Wilde's, Mr. Best said, lifting his brilliant notebook, that portrait of Mr. W.H., where he proves that the sonnets were written by Willie Hughes, a man all Hughes. For Willie Hughes, is it not? The Quaker librarian asked. So, I'm going to give W.H. Auden the last word on this who is the fair youth thing. W.H. Auden said, when you read the sonnets, quote, it is nonsensical to waste time trying to identify characters. It is an idiot's job, pointless and uninteresting. It's just gossip. So, good point, W.H. Auden, but at the same time, gossip is kind of irresistible, right? One last theory, speaking of straightwashing, the playwright Tom Stoppard wrote the script for the movie Shakespeare in Love, where, if we look at the next slide, we'll see that the fair youth was actually Gwyneth Paltrow in disguise all along. What a relief! So, that brings us to the end of our look at Shakespeare, his friend, his foe, the fair youth, and whatever you want to make of it is up to you. If you'd like to learn more about Shakespeare and the sonnets, take a look in chat for references to Shakespeare and Brit Lit at the Rosenbach, some related blog posts, and what it takes to research Rosenbach collections, which I should say are free. If we take a look at the next slide, you'll see that the Rosenbach is continuing its Behind the Bookcase series. So come back next month for another virtual Behind the Bookcase. We're going to be looking at love letters in the archive, and we're going to see the heartbreaking love letter of John Keats to Fanny Braun, and also some really beautiful romantic and racy love letters from the great movie icon Marlene Dietrich to Mercedes de Costa. And how did those end up at the Rosenbach? Tune in next month and we'll explain it. In the meantime, you can also visit the Rosenbach on the next slide by coming in person and taking a tour, exploring the house with one of our amazing tour guides. You can come and check out one of our exhibits, and you can also see our beautiful, beautiful garden, which was closed for 20 years. It's just been reopened. And as you can see, it's so lovely, and it is the only garden that's left on our block. All the rest has been turned into parking. If you'd like to explore the Rosenbach from home during these uncertain COVID times, we have amazing resources for you to do so. So please check out our blog. You'll find it quite absorbing. Our Galloway Gateway has some online exhibitions you can check out about Herman Melville, Jewish history, and much, much more. And follow us on Facebook and whatever social media that you're on. So that brings us to just about the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for joining me. And if you had a good time, please do consider donating to us. That's about the end of everything I have to say about Shakespeare. It's been so lovely to share an evening with you talking about one of our favorite topics here at the Rosenbach, and that is Shakespeare. So I hope everyone has a good night, and check us out next time. Oh, and we got a nice message from Kinga who says, thank you. The last time we visited the museum, it was fascinating. Well, thank you. Thanks all of you. And we'll hang around if you want to copy down any of the links that we shared in the chat.